Welcome to Lecture 2 of Practical Skills for Social Justice Advocates. My name is David Lepofsky. In this course, we'll be using the subject of advocating for people with disabilities, especially in the context of the education system, as our platform for learning. So I'm going to use this talk to introduce you to the world of the disability community, of people with disabilities, and provide the context in which our advocacy strategies will be discussed. I want to go over a few topics. I'm going to talk generally about the disability community and its makeup, the barriers they face, the world we live in. I myself am blind, but these are applicable to lots of other folks. I want to talk specifically about the world confronting students with disabilities in our school system. I'm going to talk a bit about disability lingo, the terminology to use or to avoid. I want to talk about the organizational structure of the disability community. And I'm going to wrap up with an idea that I want to share about the future of disability advocacy and the idea of disability advocacy startups. Now, we're talking about the situation in Canada and particularly in the province of Ontario, but if anyone's watching this from anywhere else in Canada or around the world, these observations in many cases will apply to you. So feel free to draw on these or think about the way that things may be different in your community and to what extent that might affect the strategies I'll be talking about later in this series of videos. So first, the world confronting people with disabilities, a world full of barriers. When I talk about people with disabilities, I'm talking about people with any kind of disability, whether it's a physical disability like using a wheelchair or other mobility device, a sensory disability such as deafness or hearing loss, blindness like myself, or vision loss, communication disabilities, intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, psychosocial or mental health disabilities, you name it, temporary or permanent ones, episodic ones, ones that are visible. When I walk in a room, if you're sighted, I got a white cane, you know I got a vision disability, and many of which are invisible. They're not known to an onlooker unless they're identified. We folks with disabilities, wherever we are in the world, we find that we live in a world that is pervasively organized and designed on a pervasive, omnipresent kind of premise that is utterly absurd. That is to say, we find that the world that we live in is overwhelmingly designed and operated as if it is for people who have no disabilities, and only for them. The public transit we ride, the buildings we go into, the workplaces where we want to work or do work, the schools where we study, the universities where we study, the healthcare and other public services that we need to use, the shops where we shop and the products sold there, even the laws that we live under and the justice system that is responsible for administering them, they are overwhelmingly designed and operated on this premise. Now, who does this hurt? Well, it hurts the 2.9 million people with disabilities in the province of Ontario as I speak, the over 8 million people in Canada, the upwards of 1 billion people with disabilities around the world. And those numbers are huge, but they actually understate the problem. Because you see, everybody has a disability now, or someone near and dear to them who has a disability, or is bound to get one later in life. Because the biggest cause of disability is aging, and gradually, we're all aging. The reality of this world permeates to the point where we face laws that are written based on this absurd premise. We find that professions that we need to rely on, whether it's lawyers or doctors or any other kind of profession, their training largely assumes that their clients or patients won't have disabilities. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's kind of built into a lot of the way they're taught about service provision. And, and this is everywhere. Now, that's not to say nobody's doing anything for us, don't get me wrong, but largely it's kind of an afterthought, especially after some social justice advocates get busy doing advocacy to try to change this generation after generation practice. Now, speaking here in the province of Ontario and in Canada, these barriers, the barriers we face, the physical barriers, the technology barriers, the bureaucratic barriers, the legal barriers, the attitude barriers, all of those barriers, one way or other, are illegal. One way or other, they violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees equality to people with disabilities if they are either barriers for which the provincial or federal or municipal governments or other government bodies are responsible, or if they are part of a government program, even if it's delivered by private sector organizations. They violate the provincial or federal human rights code or anti-discrimination law, whichever happens to apply. And they may violate as well the requirements of provincial or federal accessibility legislation. Ontario has the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. In the federal sphere, we have the Accessible Canada Act. And the only significant legal question is not, are they illegal, but how long an obligated organization has to remove them. The guarantee of equality to us, people with disabilities, includes a duty both to remove existing barriers and a duty to prevent the creation of new barriers. And believe me, new barriers are being created all the time. Core to the guarantee of equality is a duty to accommodate the needs of people with disabilities. It's not an absolute duty. It is subject to the defense of undue hardship. If an obligated organization could show they did everything they could, but short of undue hardship, and that doing anything more, it was impossible to do anything more without undue hardship, they can mount a defense, but they've got the burden to prove it. So our law presumes that accommodation is feasible. Our Supreme Court of Canada requires that fulfilling the duty to accommodate requires serious and substantial efforts, and it includes not only a duty to actually accommodate our needs, deliver an accommodation we need. I'm a blind person staying in a hotel. How about putting Braille on my door of my room or beside the room so I can know what room number I'm in and that I'm at the right room? But it includes a procedural duty to accommodate. That means that an obligated organization has a duty, if it hasn't accommodated, to investigate alternative solutions. It can't just leave it to people with disabilities to have to point out what they need to do. They've got a duty to investigate. It's a procedural duty, and it again is subject to the undue hardship defense, but that defense is something that an obligated organization has to prove. And another critical factor in understanding this duty, and why I say these are all illegal and eventually they got to go, is that an organization can't just say, oh, it costs too much to do that this year, so we're not going to ever do anything. If it's cost too much this year, they may be able to justify delay, but they can't justify doing nothing ever. Moreover, a big organization like a government, when we decide what's undue hardship, we evaluate what the capacity of the whole organization, the whole government. If the government wants to say, oh, the cost of doing that would be an undue hardship for the government, they can't just say it's an undue hardship to our little office somewhere in the government. It's got to be an undue hardship to the government given its collective capacities. Now, when we look at this world full of barriers that faces people with disabilities, it, it's great that they're all illegal, but the reality is it's been illegal for decades, and yet most of the old barriers are still there, and new ones, as I said, are being created all the time. Well, why the heck is that? Well, it's the case because enforcing these rights, whether it's our anti-discrimination law, the Human Rights Code, takes years of litigating before the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. It could take 5 years just to get a hearing. And in the case of our constitutional Charter of Rights, means you got to lawyer up if you're a victim of one of these barriers and litigate for years. And the government on the other side has access to publicly funded government lawyers to defend themselves. So guess what? Most people with disabilities don't litigate most of the barriers they face, and probably never will, especially because they have limited access to legal services, and disproportionately they are poor, living at or below the poverty line, and have other budgetary priorities for what money they do have, not spending it on lawyers to litigate barriers. This led over 2 decades ago to efforts in different jurisdictions, starting in the United States, in Ontario starting in 1994, to try to get legislation enacted that would remove and prevent these barriers without individuals with disabilities having to litigate them one at a time. The limitation on those laws, which we won't have time to go through in this course, but there's ample available for one who wants to research it. The limitation of those laws is that, at least within Canada, they have not been very effectively implemented. Governments have done a poor job of implementing and enforcing them, so that they have not lived up to their potential. Let me turn to the question of disability lingo. Now, when I talk about this, let me disabuse people of any worry that, oh, this is going to be, well, some people denigrate any talk of terminology as if it's, oh, I don't know, political correctness or wokeness. I find those terms troubling when they're marshaled for a whole lot of reasons. But in any event, that's not what this is all about. Or either as those are used by their critics or their proponents, and so on. Disability language, disability terminology is regularly evolving. I can tell you right now that I've been doing advocacy in this area as a volunteer for decades. I don't always keep up. Moreover, it's evolving such that I can look back at articles I've written or public statements I've made or presentations to legislatures I've made years ago, and I'm using terminology that at the time was totally appropriate and now is utterly rejected. So my best advice to you is don't sweat making mistakes. Don't worry about it. The best thing you can do is to follow 2 basic guiding principles. First, ask people what terminology they prefer. Among people with disabilities, there are disagreements actually about what they like, or what they prefer, and it's best to just ask and find out. Heck, I do that too. And the other thing to do is, and this is an easy one to follow, but it's important to be aware of. There's one universal constant, and that is, don't use pejorative language. You'll see this in the media from time to time. Even some politicians use this. Don't talk about people suffering from disabilities, those afflicted with blindness, victims of cerebral palsy, people confined to wheelchairs. People I know who use wheelchairs don't think of them as confining, but rather as liberating. If you just avoid using that kind of pejorative language that conveys this notion that we are suffering and living miserable lives, that will not only help, but if somebody uses that kind of language, it can actually undermine efforts at organizing people, because people can be hurt by language that makes it sound like they're victims and suffering and miserable and, oh, what a horrible life you have. Actually, that kind of language can exacerbate stereotypes, and our goal is to overcome stereotypes. Now, in recent years, or frankly, for several decades, the prime terminology that you'll hear used, and that I use, is people with disabilities. Why? Because we want to be known as people first, not totally defined by disability. I'm a whole person. One facet of me is my disability, but we want to be known as people first. And in fact, for years, there's been an important self-help advocacy community for people with intellectual disabilities called People First. However, there are some people who have gone back to using the term disabled persons, a term that a number of people had sort of moved away from. And the argument they use is they are disabled, but they're disabled by the barriers they face. And by the barriers in our community. So it's sort of an attempt to use terminology that's aimed at shifting this idea that a disability is somehow a problem, but rather towards the idea that it's the environment that creates the limitations. I myself don't do that because I'm not sure the terminology actually will convey that to people who don't already know that. But heck, whatever people use, best to just ask and find out what they think. Now, let me talk about creative use of terminology. There's room to be inventive. We used to talk in the education system just about students with special needs. Now, to some, including me, special needs is almost it sounds like a pity term or pejorative. I tend to use the term students with disabilities because it works. We used to use the term, and lots of people still do, caregiver. I like to think of care partner because often it's a two-way street. If it's a person with a disability and they have a care partner, the care partner may be assisting with some things, and the individual with disability will be assisting their care partner with some things. It's more reciprocal. What I can tell you in terms of understanding disability and lingo is that overwhelmingly among people with disabilities, more and more, there is a serious concern about what we call inspiration porn. What is that? A stereotypical view of people with disabilities that they're either pitiful and sad, or they do amazing things and they're so inspiring, it's unbelievable how they could do that. Often embedded in some of that is a perception that, well, if you have that particular disability, whether it's my blindness or something else, implicit, it almost suggests that, well, you shouldn't really be able to do very much. You should be pretty much helpless. So if you are successful in career, independent living, and so on, you must be amazing, and so on. It actually is a wounding form of what is intended as a compliment. And it's called inspiration porn because when it is used pervasively, it actually undermines efforts at building a fully inclusive and society in which people with disabilities can fully participate to the extent of their individual abilities. Now, let me talk to you for just a minute about a bit of the demography of the disability community. I advocated I mentioned this before, but I want to build on it. Because disability is the largest cause is aging, then what you find is that people with disabilities, depending on the disability, disproportionately are older. And you will find, for example, that the predominant cause of blindness, again, I use the example because I'm familiar, or significant vision loss is getting older. So yes, there are some newborn babies and youth and teens with vision loss, but they are a very small number. On the other hand, the prominence of vision loss among people over the ages of 60, 70, 80, much, much higher. Now, the the uh, the next variable I will tell you about disability is that of poverty. Uh, Disproportionately, as I mentioned, people with disabilities live at or below the poverty line. They also disproportionately face unemployment and underemployment. My late friend David Onley, the former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, said back in 2016, and I quote, or actually 2014, I've quoted him about 1 million times since, that the national unemployment rate facing Canadians with disabilities is not only a national crisis, it's a national shame. People with disabilities are disproportionately dependent on not only social assistance, which is sub-poverty levels, but disproportionately dependent on public programs, public services, and the barriers they face in connection with them resonate and compound against them. Um, when we talk about people with disabilities, I mean all the different disabilities I've referred to. When you say disability, and especially if you say accessibility, some people just think about people in wheelchairs, and the disability symbol traditionally used, referring to somebody in a wheelchair, reinforces that. But in fact, they are an important part of the disability community, but just part. Um, the other thing that is important to understand about the experience of people with disabilities and how this demography interplays with them is this. There are, of course, people with disabilities in every social group. Disability knows no limits based on age or religion or race or ethnic origin or gender identity or gender, anything. So you'll hear increasing discussion, especially within equality seeking groups, about intersectionality, which is a term used to refer to, for example, people with in our context, uh, women with disabilities, um, or people from racialized communities with disabilities, and also Indigenous people with disabilities, to move away from some stereotype that somehow, when we think about people with disabilities, we aren't thinking about those equality-seeking statuses. And where it's relevant within this understanding of our demography is that when you add equality-seeking designations, both person with disability and racialized, you often are multiplying disadvantage. There are compounding effects of the different kinds of disadvantage they can face upon each other that can accelerate that disadvantage. The other compounding effect that's worth understanding is this. Within the world of equality, there has historically been a tendency to think about silos of life activities like transportation or employment or education. They are multiply compounding. You can't get a good job if you can't get a good education. So barriers in the education system facing students with disabilities makes it harder for them to get a good job and compounds the unemployment rates they face. Transportation barriers can impede both participation in education and in employment. If you can't get there, it's harder to avail yourself of what is available, whether it's at a school or at a job. Now, we have opportunities for remote working, but people with disabilities have experienced barriers in that context too. Now, let me turn to the world of students with disabilities. This because in this series of lectures, I'm going to be using them and their experience as a platform to focus on some of the social justice skills that we'll be talking about. Let me use Ontario as an example, and our kindergarten to grade 12 system. There are about 2 million students in Ontario-funded schools. Of them, 1/3 of a million at least are known to be students with disabilities. Probably there are more. So it's 1 in 6, could be as high as 1 in 5. Of these students, they are in effect second-class citizens in the education system. I have been extensively involved in doing advocacy in this area, and in the supporting links and resources for these lectures, you'll see how to learn more about that. The school system here in Ontario and elsewhere tends to be full of the very kinds of disability barriers I've talked about before, whether it's school buildings that have physical barriers, school gym equipment, or playgrounds, or digital equipment that are designed on the assumption that they are for students without disabilities and that don't take into account the accessibility needs of students with disabilities. Add to that the fact that our school boards can be replete with bureaucratic barriers and indeed legal barriers that make it harder for these kids to fully participate and benefit from what schools have to offer. Our education system pretty much has been designed on that same premise I talked about earlier on. It's designed as if there's some notional, quote, normal student, and that student is the target of the education system. And anyone who doesn't fit within that, quote, normal profile is, well, they're treated as exceptional. And not only are they treated as exceptional, and I don't mean that as a compliment, I mean like they're not normal, but our Education Act actually calls them exceptional pupils. It's kind of a legislative way of saying weird. And their disabilities are referred to in our education legislation not as disabilities, but exceptionalities. So you've got a school system that is premised on this. And then what do exceptional pupils, what's provided for them? It's called special education. Now, I don't want to preoccupy with terminology, but the terminology conveys the idea that this isn't like part of the regular, this isn't kind of the way we do stuff. This is kind of an afterthought we've laid on after we designed a system that, well, kind of treats these folks as second-class citizens. Now, there are lots of problems with this. They don't use the word normal anymore, but they used to in the school system. That was used to define the class of students who was sort of their target market. But let's just look at this term exceptional. Can you imagine a place of employment that said, well, we have exceptional employees, and then, we have normal employees, then we have women. That would be considered sexist. Or we have normal employees, then we have non-whites. That would be considered racist. But here, we functionally have the equivalent when it comes to kids with disabilities. But it gets worse. The definition of exceptional pupil doesn't include all disabilities. For example, a psychosocial or mental health condition that doesn't lead to a behavior problem isn't covered. ADHD is not covered. So as just a couple of illustrations. So while we have a right to equal education in our Human Rights Code, in our Charter of Rights, our actual education legislation that implements it leaves certain students out. Now, that's not to say that principals and teachers don't want to serve them, but the education bureaucracy, the special education budgets and regimes don't include them. Moreover, the definition of exceptionality doesn't just include students with some disability, it includes gifted students. Now, some gifted students have disabilities, and their disability, they got a right to be accommodated. Others are gifted students without disabilities. Now, I want to be clear. I totally support ensuring that gifted students have education tailored to their needs, including gifted students without disabilities. But an education system that lumps together all of these folks, including gifted students who have no disabilities, makes no sense. And nobody, when I've raised this in the education system, has ever suggested there's a policy rationale for it that makes any sense. Now, the last thing I want to do when I talk about the school system is just to explain that beyond the buildings, the digital equipment, and the bureaucracy, there are other intrinsic or inherent or built-in barriers. Our teachers are trained as if they're going to work in two different silos. We have general education teachers, and then we have special education teachers. And we don't ensure that our general education teachers are equipped to teach all learners. So we've kind of built silos in to begin with. And then add to that the fact that we've designed classes that way. We have special education or segregated classes, and then we have mainstream classes, which are supposed to be pursuing a goal of inclusion of students with disabilities wherever possible, but which are not staffed and designed in a way to ensure that students with disabilities in those classes will always get the supports that they need so that they can function and thrive there. So the structure of the system creates a bunch more of the barriers. Add to the fact that our conventional forms of teaching over the years kind of were built, and curriculums and so on were designed on the basis of them being delivered to students without disabilities, and learning rather than designing it on the assumption that it is to be targeted to all learners. There is a more modern concept. It's called Universal Design and Learning, or UDL. But we aren't ensuring that everyone who teaches in our classrooms and everyone who's designing the curriculum there both has been properly educated in UDL and is actually deploying it. It's totally haphazard when we run into this. So given that reality they face, now I'm going to turn to the organizational structure of the disability community. If you're going to do social justice advocacy for any community, you want to get the lay of the land. You want to get the organizational landscape so you know what kind of context you're going to operate in. You design your strategy to serve it best, or to ensure you get uptake as best you can. Historically, there have been two kinds of organizations within the disability community here. One is service providers. These are typically nonprofit charitable organizations. Far more rare that they are government organizations, though they may have some government funding. They tend to be, they could be provincial, they could be nationwide. They tend to be disability specific. An organization for serving blind people or people with vision loss, organizations serving people with intellectual disabilities. They may be age focused, such as Easter Seals, which serves kids with physical disabilities, as opposed to the March of Dimes that serves, one of the organizations that serves adults with physical disabilities. As being nonprofit charitables, they are, of course, dependent on donations from private donors, but they also will get some degree of government funding, depending on the organization, depending on the project, depending on the grants that they... Typically, some of these nonprofit charities have different governance structures. Some of them have a self-appointing membership, or a board that is appointed by a tiny group, and others are consumer membership organizations. So if I can contrast, again, in the blindness sphere, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, which provides services to blind and low vision people in Canada, is not a broad membership organization. Any visually impaired person can't join. become a member. They can be a client or consumer, but they can't be a member. There's a small group of people who the board appoints as members, and they in turn select the board. In contrast, the Blind Low Vision New Zealand is a membership organization. Any of their clients can also become a member, has a vote in who serves on the board. Nonprofit charitable organizations have varying capacity to do social justice advocacy. Many will have advocacy in their stated goals to some extent. But depending on their staff, they may not have any lawyers working there. There may not have anybody with policy expertise. It depends. And so they may want to do advocacy, and they may in fact engage in advocacy, but they may not have, it'll vary as to how much capacity they have to do some of the detailed work that I'm going to be describing in these lectures. These organizations also, depending on the organizations, may feel tension about engaging in vigorous advocacy, i.e. if they may get funding from government and may be reluctant to be seen as advocating too strongly because the government may not want to maintain their funding. I think that is, I've for a long time felt that anyone who fears that is probably incorrect, because the last thing I would imagine a government would want to do is be seen as defunding a major respected community nonprofit charitable organization by virtue of its policy position advocating for disability rights. But that doesn't mean that that fear doesn't exist in people's minds and may affect their behavior. As well, there is, depending on their board structure, if their boards are more driven, made up of donors or people drawn from the business community than from the consumer population, their client population, there may be less of a disposition towards seeing the importance of advocacy or rating it as a priority activity. I'm not trying to make blunt observations about all of them. It's going to vary one to the next. And within the same organization, it can vary from one period of time to the next, depending on changes in management and changes in board composition. The second category of disability organizations that you'll find in the community historically are what we have referred to in the past as consumer organizations. They used that word, that term, because they were emphasizing that their members are consumers of the services that these service provider organizations provide. They tend to be core focused on peer support and advocacy. Some do more peer support, some do more advocacy. These consumer groups can be, in some cases, they are single disability based, and others are cross-disability organizations. They can be local in a town, they can be province-wide, they can be national. The major national one within Canada now is the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, or CCD. Now, these organizations, these consumer groups, may be unfunded completely. They may be a purely volunteer exercise, or they may get grants from government, or they may get private donations, or both. They may or may not have staff. They can be big or small. And within them, if they are a permanent existing organization, there can be internal dynamics that you as a social justice advocate need to know about. If there is, for example, a cross-disability coalition, I've seen this in a number of different places, that pre-exists, has people in it who've got a set of priorities. If you come to them with a new priority, such as when they were approached in the 1990s in Ontario, or in the 2010s in Manitoba, or elsewhere to take on a new priority like fighting for a Disabilities Act, some folks in that organization, in that consumer group, might not want to take it up. It may not be that they got anything against the Disabilities Act. It's just we've got our own priorities. We've been working on these. And if you've lived in that organization and worked in that organization as a volunteer, you've spent a lot of time just trying to get your priority to become the organization's priority. And if all of a sudden somebody comes from the outside of the organization and tries to sell them on a new priority, you might think, well, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, we only have so much capacity. And so they may not take on that idea right away or at all. And this is an important thing to be aware of if you're going to undertake community advocacy. The other thing to know about these community groups, it's not unique to them, but their membership can be transitory. It can be transitory just because people come and go or people burn out, but it can be transitory because of the nature of the organization. Some law schools have a local organization of law students with disabilities. Well, you're only in law school for 3 years typically, unless you're doing a combined degree, and that's 4 years. So they may be booming for a while, and then over time, the next generation of students there don't pick it up or don't continue on or whatever, and it could fade and then be reborn later. If it's an organization of parents of kids defined by a particular disability, once their children age out, you'll find a cohort of the leadership will move along, and you have to wait for a new cohort of leadership to take things on, possibly reshaping the whole effort. In undertaking this advocacy within the disability community, there is a long-standing potential controversy. I don't think it's a big deal, and I don't think now it has the same significance that it used to have, but it's important to be alive to it. What's that controversy or debate? Who should advocate for people with disabilities? There was a strong view for a long time, and to some extent there are people who still will vigorously argue it and passionately argue it, and that is that only people with disabilities should be doing this advocacy. Only they should speak for themselves. Service organizations have really no place to do this other than maybe as providing support resources, and it's paternalistic for others to speak for them. And similarly, people without disabilities shouldn't be doing this advocacy. Leave it to people with disabilities to do it themselves. And there's a coherence to that view. I take a different view. And I respect people who have a contrary view. But my view is this. Our problem is not that we have too many advocates pressing disability issues. We always need more. So strategically, it's my view that it's best to get more people on board. The more, the better, and the more that want to speak up, that's great. But not only that, I don't differentiate between people with disabilities doing this advocacy and people without disabilities doing this advocacy, because it's my view that everybody, as I said earlier, has a disability now or gets one later. We are the minority of everyone. We are the minority of everyone. So everyone has a stake in tearing down disability barriers. And if a person with a disability fights for tearing down barriers, that's to get those barriers away from out of their path. If a person without a disability advocates to tear down barriers, that's because they have a stake in not having to face those barriers when the time comes for them to acquire a disability later in their life. Put another way, if an advocate's message is wrong, I don't care who's saying with it. I want to persuade them to use a different message. If an advocate's message is good and I agree with it, if it's a good message, then I don't care who's saying it. The more saying it, the better. Let me finally turn to kind of my vision of the future. I think the advocacy by nonprofit charitable disability charities is going to continue, and I think that's a good thing. I think advocacy by consumer groups is going to continue, and I think that's a good thing too. But I think the future is going to be heavily improved by the addition or the increased presence of what I like to call disability advocacy startups. What am I talking about? Well, a business startup is a startup that is not a huge corporation that just branches into a new area of work or something. It's when a small group of business venturers decide to try on a new business idea. So they start up from scratch, and they may be just volunteers, they may have very little capital, but they start building up their idea and developing it from scratch. They are a startup. And startups can at times get going more quickly and more creatively than large, lumbering, pre-existing corporations. Once they get their idea moving it forward, if it's successful and there's capital, they can attract capital to it. Eventually, you may find one of those large, huge organizations, corporations coming along and buying them up, which is a sign of success. Well, I like the idea of the business startup, which allows for creativity, irreverence, experimentation, and getting started quickly without having bureaucracies you got to battle. So my proposal is this idea of the disability advocacy startup. Instead of trying to worry about selling an existing organization on why you should advocate for the social justice advocacy goal that you're interested in, how about we do it differently? How about we get a few people together, maybe just one or two or three, who are like-minded and who think, hey, this is worth doing. Why don't we start pushing for this? And the beauty of that is to get started, you don't need to persuade anyone. The two or three or four of you think it's a good idea. Let's get going. You might decide to give it a name. You might decide to frame what's our common goal. Typically, a disability advocacy startup is not an all-purpose for all things organization. It will be aimed at a particular goal. I have experience with this. Back in 1994, some people that I knew and I wanted the Ontario government to pass new disability legislation. This eventually became the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. But we got together and through a chain of events I'll talk about a little later in this series, we decided to form a coalition. We didn't ask anybody else to hop on board or try to persuade them to join first. We just got a small group of us together and we started building. And that coalition didn't even have a name at the start, but it grew and it expanded and people hopped on board over time. And eventually it was, over time, it was successful. Rather than waiting to persuade others to join before you even start, they get started. My vision of the disability startup is like a high-speed train. The whole idea is get going and get going fast. And as for others, they got a couple of choices. They can hop on now and help us get where we're going. They can hop on later. They can stay at the side and watch us go by. The only thing you don't want to be is on the tracks as we're whipping along. And the beauty of that is, as I'll describe more in these lectures, but people can get involved at the time and stage they want. And if you run one of these operations, the beauty of it is you can start out with no money at all. In fact, you can keep going with no money at all and use resources like Zoom or social media and stuff like that and Facebook and make and potentially have a lot of impact. I am involved in one particular group right now that's been around for about 5 years that's based in Toronto, but for Ontario. And it's a group of individuals and organizations who are trying to oppose the expansion of the use of electric scooters in our public spaces because they endanger people with disabilities. We meet every month or every couple of months, sometimes more frequently. We fought various battles. We don't even have a name. We just have a small group that we've pulled some more people in. Some have left over time, but we've mounted quite a significant campaign and helped gotten other people advocating. And that's with a group that has no name. We have no governing structure. All we know is we're people who came together to fight against electric scooters. Think of the traditional organization. If you want to form an organization, you set broad criteria, you have to start fundraising, you decide if you're going to incorporate bylaws, committees, formal structure, motions to approve the minutes and all that stuff. You can make progress without engaging in all of that stuff. Think of it this way. One of the problems within traditional organizations, advocacy organizations that you might have seen, if they're kind of all-purpose, is, well, one is if they don't accept your priority at all. The second is if they get burdened down with committee structures, that there's always a core of people who do all the work, but it may be that the committee chairs in some cases are doing the work, in some cases they're not, and then you got to work around them. Some of these organizations can end up having to live from one grant to the next, so you spend more time than struggling to just get money. If you want to hire staff, you want staff who are prepared to stay, but unless you have stable funding, that could be a problem, and it may not attract people who obviously and understandably need job security. So the disability startup, the beauty of this is, however we do it, is there are no rules. It can be faster to get started, faster to get active. It can be more effective, and it can be less frustrating. Now, you might wonder, well, how can you get this stuff? If you're so informal, how's it going to function? Well, one of the things I found is, if you ask somebody, will you chair a committee for the next year? Anybody I know will likely say, no, I will too. I don't want to take it on. On the other hand, in an informal structure, you say, hey, we're doing an event in the next 3 weeks. Could you just work on a working group just to help pull it together? Well, that's fine. That's easier. I don't mind. I can pull that off. The other thing that's helpful about this, you might think, well, it's better to have a large, well-established organization. That can be effective. But on the other hand, in these days of social media and rapid news cycles, just pulling together the group, having a name, having a public face, having somebody who's prepared to say what needs to be said, and having a plausible case to make may have a significant impact without all the time and effort that's necessary to establish a more permanent, long-standing organization. Anyway, the tips I'm going to provide for these lectures will apply whether you're in any of these kinds of organization. But let me conclude by saying that now that we know how these organization or how the disability community is configured, let's turn our attention to rolling up our sleeves and getting to work doing some actual advocacy with and within that community.